Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'll be discussing the 1928 film Our Dancing Daughters with my friend Vicki Lesly, who writes Meandering Over the Pebbles newsletter. Vicki, welcome back to the podcast.
It's wonderful to be back. Thanks for having me again.
So we'll get into the film in a moment, but before we do, remind listeners briefly where they can find your work.
Yeah, so my Substack is currently called Meandering Over the Pebbles. It's about to get a shiny new rebrand soon, but that hasn't happened yet. So maybe we can pop back into the show notes when that's up. But currently, well, actually, you'll still be able to access it on the same URL. It's just vickilesly.substack.com, but it's going to be slightly more film related, I think, because I'm a documentary filmmaker and parent. So there's some of midlife, parenting, fun, and lots of documentary stuff and lots of old movies. I love old movies, so it's been a pleasure to get to know you and your great project about the Oscars.
Fantastic. Well, last week we circled back to Glorious Betsy from the first Academy Awards, which was actually released after Street Angel and Skyscraper, which we discussed the week prior. With this film, we're jumping ahead to the end of the summer of 1928, so we want to catch up on some world events that have happened in that summertime period. Let's see. In my notes, I have that in June, Amelia Earhart, obviously famous female pilot, becomes the first woman to make a successful transatlantic flight. But she was a passenger in a plane piloted by a man by the name of Wilmer Stultz. They flew from Newfoundland to Wales. We had a whole bunch of United States presidential things going on. Al Smith became the Democratic nominee for president, which I'm sure we'll cover, who actually ended up winning that presidential election in 1928 once we get a little bit further on. The Summer Olympics in 1928 took place in Amsterdam and was the first time that women's athletics and women's gymnastics both appeared in the Olympics. So
yeah, exciting times for the late 20s.
Yes, and I didn't verify this fact, but I thought it was kind of wild that the first color television was demonstrated in early July of 1928. I didn't even know there was black and white television at that time, so that's
That
crazy.
is wild. Wow.
And then some notable names that have been born since we last checked in. May 4th, Hosni Mubarak, future president of Egypt. May 12th, Burt Bacharach, the musician. June 10th, Maurice Sendak, who people might recognize as the author of Where the Wild Things Are. And then on July 26th, two birthdays, Stanley Kubrick, director of obviously 2001 and Dr. Strangelove, among others, and Joe Jackson, father of Michael Jackson. So those are some of the folks who have entered our world since we last talked about a movie. And with that, I want to move on to Our Dancing Daughters, our film for today. So the film debuted on September 1st, 1928. It was directed by Harry Beaumont with titles written by Marion Ainsley and Ruth Cummings from a story by Josephine Lovett.
On the screen, most famously, its breakout star is Joan Crawford as Diana, then John Mac Brown as Ben, Niels Astor as Norman, Dorothy Sebastian as Beatrice, and Anita Page as Anne. The film's running time is 85 minutes. It was produced by Hunt Stromberg and it was distributed by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer with the fantastic Roaring Lion at the start of the movie.
That's right. That's right. One of the first times we get to see Leo in his full glory.
Yeah.
Lovett was nominated for Best Writing, and George Barnes was nominated for Best Cinematography at the Second Academy Awards. And the film is readily available both on DVD releases, I think there's a Blu-ray as well, and a very nice transfer on YouTube, and it's also on the film's Wikipedia page. You can check it out. So lots of ways to watch this film if you've never seen it before.
Yeah, I saw a few reviews of the Blu-ray as well. Apparently, the Blu-ray transfer is really great. I mean, I watched it on YouTube, but I saw a few reviews that were really raving about the quality of that Blu-ray transfer for the real buffs. You want to see it in its full glory.
Yeah, I saw some of those notes as well. So definitely, folks want to check it out. There's ways to see it in pretty decent quality. So our basic plot here is where obviously the title kind of tells us a lot of what's going on. We've got the three young women that you mentioned, Diana, Beatrice, and Anne, who are the daughters of the title. And we meet them all at the beginning in various forms, a couple of them with their mothers, getting ready to kind of go out for a night on the town. Diana is the more flamboyant of the daughters when we first meet them at the beginning. And then Anne kind of appears to be this reserved, a little more shy, I might almost say a goody two shoes, I guess, that she comes across. But as we'll find out later, it's both of them are not always as they seem, and actually Beatrice is not always as she seems when we first meet all of them at the beginning of the film either.
Did you notice there was a great, I guess, sort of stylistic to all three of those women, we first see them whip through their legs. The opening shot
Yes,
of Joan Crawford's legs is literally she's doing the Charleston. It's incredible.
the dancing, yeah.
I was just seeing that on my TV, but imagining being there in the movie theater and seeing Joan Crawford's swiveling heels up on the screen. And then, yeah, we also quite risque, I guess we'll come on to talk about this pre-code Hollywood, but then I think it was Anne we see with it's like a close up of her leg with the stockings. And then Beatrice, I think she's just standing in the hall. They kind of her and her beau are about to go on a night out, and the parents are kind of telling them to not to hang around with that crazy Diana too much, but that also starts with her legs in the hallway. So it's a kind of fun little visual motif, I guess, that they're all introduced via by legs.
Yeah, early kind of, very stylistic, very deliberate, cinematography choices, I think, in all of those cases,
Yeah.
and kinda speaks to the nomination that that got, among, many other things that we see throughout, the film. So, we get them all out at a party, dance, they're having a great time, meeting their friends, and as we go along, Beatrice is there with her Beau Norman that you mentioned, and then Ben is introduced, and he's kind of the love interest for both Diana and for Anne. And they each get their moments with him throughout that party. We get a really wonderful part where Diana gets out in the floor and eventually up on a stage, almost as a stage dive into the
Yeah, it's
crowd.
incredible. That's a real showstopper, isn't it? That with the balloons all over the
Yeah.
ceiling, and yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, some really interesting scenic choices there, and I saw a lot of notes about, in looking into this where they're talking about the Art Deco design of
Oh, the sets
everything
were
in
out
in the
as well, the
scenery.
huge
Yeah, the sets are just crazy.
if you love that, if you're into that period and seeing, I mean, I know it's a Hollywood studio, they're they're fake sets, but still, like, it's
Right, yeah.
real period design. It's like it's amazing, it's such a almost like a cliched period now, the 20s and the deco styling, but actually seeing it kind of there originally and in that fantastic black and white cinematography, yeah, it really sings on the screen.
Definitely, and I noted too that, the all of these characters are obviously very high society. They're walking around in tuxedos all the time. The guys are. The women are in these fantastic dresses, and I wondered a little bit if, it's coming out in late 1928, and obviously we know what's coming with the
Yeah,
stock market and things like that down the road. I wonder, had it come out a year or two later, if it might not have been as well received, seeing all these
yeah,
ritzy folks
yeah,
just having a
for
great
sure.
time.
Yeah, it's very hard, watching it. Not very hard, but, you can't well, not even necessarily a modern audience, but just an audience slightly further into the future from the time it came out. You couldn't help but be watching it knowing there's these dark clouds gathering over all of these bright young things, but in the moment, they're just having an absolutely glorious time.
So we get some really fun things happening at this party. Eventually, the girls all get home. The Anne and Diana tell their mothers about this great guy that they met. Obviously, both talking about Ben. And then eventually, we get to kind of the next sequence where they're on a picnic. They're out in the at a lodge or something, having some time in the woods and near a beach. We get a scene with we get a little thing where I guess it's kind of hard to tell what exactly what's going on, but the Diana kind of tricks everybody to going off, and Ben stays behind, so she gets a few
Yeah.
moments with Ben there. And then a little bit later on in this whole sequence where they're out at this lodge or whatever, Anne gets a similar moment alone with Ben. I think they both end up kind of on the beach area with him in very similarly shot,
Yeah.
similarly contexted scenes.
Yeah, and that beach, setting was I mean, the cinematography, I wonder if that was I mean, it was shot in a studio, but that must have been location shooting, surely, that beach scene. I mean, the lighting and the yeah, and as you say, they're kind of mirroring of those 2 scenes with the 2 girls with the dashing, millionaire, I think.
And I was instantly reminded, and obviously the scene that I'm about to mention probably took inspiration from this rather than the other way around since it came much later. But the famous scene in the film From Here to Eternity, where the couple is on the beach and the wave kind of crashes over them as they're
Yeah.
embraced on the beach. I thought immediately of that when I saw those scenes of
Yeah.
the pairs on the beach.
Yeah, for sure. I was just gonna say they mentioned a yacht club, didn't they? So I don't know whether, this was the yacht club or although I don't think we ever saw any yachts, but
Yeah, that's kind of the feeling that I had too. They were obviously, like you said, they're all rich folks. And it sounded like at the very least, Anne was a member of this yacht club because when they have the going away party for Diana later on,
yeah.
that we'll get to, she mentions, I'm a member or this is my club, so I'm always invited, something along those lines.
Yeah.
So we get back, the party continues, or a new party, I guess, is going on at this club in the evening, and that's when Anne and Ben have their moment away. And when they get back to the party, they obviously indicate that there's an engagement going on, which frustrates, angers, upsets Diana. And she kind of eventually goes back to her parents that evening. She talks to, I think, Beatrice about it. She talks to her parents that evening. Why can't I find a good man?
Yeah.
Why can't I settle down like everyone else is settling down, that we
I
see
thought
throughout
this
the
that
film?
scene as well, I noted down while I was watching just that, like, her eyes, because obviously
Yes.
we'll talk about this. We've got all these great intertitles with the text telling us the story because it is basically still a silent movie. But just that scene when it's all in the eyes, but it didn't feel overacted to me. It just felt really like, wow, she just like her eyes are kind of burning, and then then the tears come. Like strangely naturalistic acting in a way for such a kind of hyper I mean, I guess, this was where we first see the Joan Crawford that's gonna go on and become this kind of mega star. That I thought that's a really great, lovely moment.
Yeah, she definitely did so much with her eyes
Yeah.
throughout, not just that scene, but, that was one of the ones where it really was prominent, but throughout, she's just doing so much. And I mean, she's obviously the star, she's the main attraction here, but I think many of the actors, I thought there was some instances with Ben throughout that we see where he's being very subtle in the reactions that he's giving.
That's interesting. I loved all 3 of the women and the mothers. Anne's sort of scheming mother was a great
Yeah.
character. To be honest, I found the men very interchangeable. Like, I don't know, they seemed a bit I mean, it was one of the things that I thought was quite striking. That it felt all I mean, it was women writers. It's a male director, but
Right.
it felt like the women were really the interesting ones, and the men were quite kind of seemed almost like ciphers. But maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm being harsh on Ben. Maybe you've seen some more more subtle moments that pass me by. I don't know.
I would agree with you from my first watch through it, the other day. I went back and watched a little bits and pieces of it again this morning to get ready for this, and in going back a second time, I started to see a little bit more from the guys, Ben especially, but also, Freddie, I guess is, Beatrice's brother, which I didn't realize the first time through.
Yeah, I did. I slightly wondered who he was. He was just another kind of guy in the gang, wasn't he? Oh, so he was
Yeah.
her brother. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I guess we can move on to that. So we get the engagement of Anne and Ben, and then it kind of cuts a little bit later, and Diana is going to visit the now married. I'm trying to keep all the names straight. She's going to visit Beatrice and Norman at their house now that they're married. And as you said, the two of them run into some of the old guys. They're driving by, and Beatrice invites them over to the house, which it was a little strange. I guess it makes sense because one of them was Freddie, her brother, so why wouldn't she invite them over? But it also then creates some tension between her and Norman, because, she's hanging out with all these guys, but she's married to Norman, and obviously she loves him, but it seems like there's a little bit of a deeper, darker past to Beatrice that Norman didn't quite know fully about, and gets a little bit upset about, when he sees her with all these other guys.
Did he not know that before? I thought there was some earlier scenes where she was talking before they were engaged, where she was kind of saying, "Oh, he loves me even though I have this past, even though I've had kind of other lovers," basically, I guess is what she's saying. I mean,
Yeah, it was hard for me to tell with that. I it was one of that was one of the confusing parts for that whole storyline was how much did he know, and when did he know it? And I think that would have been a little bit easier to understand had we waited a year or two and had this as a talking picture, but
for sure, yeah. I mean, some of the plotting wasn't always completely easy to understand. just because of the intertitles, and yeah, you can see them talking,
Right.
but obviously you're missing out on so much of the dialogue. So yeah, I'm sure
Yeah.
you're right.
Yeah, and then like I said, I had to go back and watch it a second time. I have to admit I was probably looking at my phone a little bit more than I should have the first time around, so missed some of the things. But definitely, I picked up more the second time around and really paid attention to some of those titles, and even this scene when Diana's visiting with Beatrice, that she gets a postcard or a letter from Anne. It must
Yes.
be like
Yeah.
they're on their
Yeah.
honeymoon or something. She's saying how great everything is, how great it is with Ben, how great everything is in paradise wherever they've gone off on their honeymoon. And then Freddie, the Beatrice's brother, gets a letter at the same time. How boring Ben is, how much of a dullard he is, and how she can't wait to get home to see Freddie. So now we find out that there's a little bit something going on between Freddie
And
and
even
Anne.
before, I remember earlier in where she's talking with her Anne, where she's talking with her mom, like very early on before she's kind of snared her rich husband. She says basically, you just have to catch them, you just have to get married, and then I'll be going off and having a fling. So it just feels like
Yep.
she's just that's what she's doing. She's already told us that's what she's going to be doing.
Exactly.
And here it is, kind of starting. Yeah.
Yep. So we get Diana makes a decision to take some time away and head off to Europe. And before she goes, Beatrice is going to throw her a big going away party. So that's kind of the whole last sequence of the film where this last party ends up. We initially see Ben and Anne together back home now, getting ready for that. But basically, Ben has said, no, you can't go. We're going to skip the going away party. So there's a whole thing there. They have a fight. He kind of starts to see through some lies that Anne is telling him. And then Ben ends up going to the party, runs into Diana, and they each kind of go off on their own because he sees Diana dancing with other guys at the party, which I think in that case, she was just having a good time. Just the party's for her. She's kind of, being with her friends or acquaintances who have come to wish her off. So I don't think there was anything nefarious on Diana's part. She was just having fun. But obviously, Ben gets a little bit jealous because, as we'll soon find out, he does still have some feelings for her as well. So Ben and Diana are at the party, and we kind of get some cross cutting between them and Freddie and Anne, who are in. They've ended up going out together and gotten quite drunk. It appears.
Yeah, that's a very funny scene. She's slurring all over the place, isn't she? I mean, as we
Yep.
can see from the from the written
From the
titles,
titles, yeah.
and obviously her acting physically. I thought Joan Crawford obviously is the star, but Anita Page was really great as Anne, especially in those later scenes where she's kind of just the mask is off, right? She's drinking, she's gonna do what she wants. She's gonna go to that party, whatever her husband says. Yeah, that scene with the two her and Freddie on the way is really fun.
So they end up getting to the party. He tells her to stay in the car because she's in no condition to face the crowd there. But of course, as soon as he heads into the party, she sneaks out of the car and heads on in herself. She eventually finds Diana and Ben, who are talking, and kind of appears that they might be trying to have a moment, but nothing really has happened. When Anne walks in and sees them together, but of course she thinks that Diana's trying to make a move on Ben and take away her husband. And we get this whole confrontation at the end. Diana admits that she has always loved Ben, but also laments that she has to leave Ben to someone like Anne, basically calling Anne out as the bad person in the relationship. So Anne kind of threatens Ben that she's going to make them suffer. As we see Diana leaving the party, and she's, I guess, heading off on her trip to Europe. And Ben kind of leaves Anne and runs after Diana. They have a little moment finally, tell each other that they love her, and she does end up getting in the car and leaving. Which brings us back to the very last couple scenes when in the party hall. We see the staff cleaning up, and Norman, Beatrice's husband, finally comes back from when we saw him exit earlier after being jealous about her male friends. And Beatrice and Norman try to get Anne to go home, even though she's still pretty tipsy, pretty drunk. And it was a little bit surprising to me how this ended up, but Anne ends up falling down a flight of stairs and dying as a result, which That was probably one of the most shocking things in the film for me was how they wrote her out of the story, so to speak, so that, of course, Ben and Diana can end up together at the very end.
Yeah, I agree with you. The falling down the stairs, it just kind of felt like they just didn't really know. They kind of had to get, to pave the way for the happy ending for Ben and Diana. They just had to get this pesky first wife out of the way, and it was so quick and so sudden, and it didn't really. I don't know. I didn't really feel like it was earned. She didn't seem sufficiently drunk, really.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. If we had seen her act that way more throughout the film, I think it would have made a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think, yeah, it came very abruptly, and that I saw it coming about 30 to 45 seconds before it actually happened, and I'm like, are they actually gonna okay, they actually did that.
Yeah. It just, I don't know, the falling down the stairs part, like, it kind of it seemed, like, almost comical, except that then she was dead and it's the screams. Oh, I guess she'd well, come on to talk about that, but that slightly, the little bit of synchronous sound effects that they had in there, that was one of the occasions where we did have it was these screams, and so it just felt a little bit jarring because it seemed almost like a funny she was being a bit sort of comic drunk lady, who won't go home. And then the next thing she's sprawled out on the bottom of the stairs with a broken neck and everyone's screaming. And it just didn't really feel like they'd paved the way to that sufficiently for us to buy into it. But that was just the very final moment. And
Yeah. Obviously, we kind of started talking some about some of the folks involved here. As we get to Harry Beaumont, the director, I didn't actually find out too much about him, which was a little bit surprising given how well regarded this film is in general. And he was also the director of the Broadway Melody, which won Best Picture this year at the Oscars. So we'll be talking about that film in a few weeks. Do you have anything that you had about
no, I didn't.
Harry
Yeah, I
Beaumont?
agree. He didn't seem to be. There didn't seem to be much. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? What remains. What is although it's not that long ago, it's 100 years ago. I mean, obviously Joan Crawford went on to become a very significant person, so there was a lot of talk about her. There didn't seem to be much about the director, or to be fair, about like I mean, I was really interested in the fact that it was an all female screenwriting team, but there was not much I could find about those a little bit, but, I suppose that's history, isn't it? It's kind of history of the winners. So there was lots
Yeah.
about and about the other, about Anita Page, who seemed to have a slightly couldn't really find the full details, but seemed like she kind of fell from favor and sort of shone brightly but briefly, and had great promise as an actress, but never really went on to too much more. Unlike Joan Crawford, who went on and was, a huge kind of legend for the next sort of, I don't know, 40 years or so.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned the writers there, so Marian Ainsley and Ruth Cummings. I guess from what I read, they did often write together, so a lot of their credits are, in pairs
Yeah.
as you go through their filmography. Obviously, this film and at least 3 others that were nominated for Oscars at the Second Academy Awards, they were the writers on, so they were obviously in high demand, even though I'd never heard of them until this point.
Yeah, and it was an interesting 'cause I hadn't really thought of it's a different thing, isn't it, writing because I was struck by the fact that, first of all, when I saw that there were 3 credited writers, I was like, "Oh, that's kinda interesting." But then you see that actually the woman who was nominated for the Oscar, she wrote the story.
Yeah, not the titles.
Those 2 they wrote the titles, but then that's a I guess it was like a completely different skill, like, almost just like jobbing, like, I think one of them had her background was as a journalist, like, it was that they were very off their time. I mean, I wrote down a couple of there was some great, "Wouldst fling a hoof with me?"
I had that one written down too. I love that.
Yeah, and all methinks there's dirty work at the crossroads tonight was another one that I
Yeah.
oh, and in fact, I've written down the one that Anne said, "Once I'm married, boy, am I gonna have a fling." These are like I guess it's the real like, I don't know how old those 2 titles writers were, but but I guess they're talking, like, really in the lingo of those young people at that time. And so maybe there's a particular skill in doing that that's distinct from the skill of coming up with the whole kind of story. I mean, the overall plot line, I thought was kind of the weakest bit really of the whole film. But that is interesting that that was the aspect of it, or one of the aspects that was actually recognized by the Academy was the kind of story, which to me was one of the least interesting parts of the whole movie.
Yeah, no, I had the same reaction, and just skipping a little bit ahead to some of the reviews of the time, I actually found one review that said there were 2 reviews that said the exact opposite things. Motion Picture Magazine said the film has youth pep, good-looking women, attractive clothes, and an awfully good story, which I don't agree with. And then it said the titles are funny, it's all very smart and modern, and Joan Crawford looks and acts better than she ever has. Then Motion Picture Classic said, "It has nothing of consequence in its plot, but succeeds in proving entertaining because of the atmospheric opulence, its colorful incident, and the personalities of the players." So one really liked the story, the other said it had no story to speak of, basically. But obviously, everything else in terms of the looks, the costumes, the actors, I think was all generally well praised.
Oh, yeah, and, you always wonder with these things, like, we're still in, the early years, the early kind of
Yeah.
the language is all still being created, so it's interesting, isn't it, that at least one of those reviews did find the story kind of inconsequential. I thought it just seemed very hackneyed. The two girls, the good girl and the bad girl, fighting over the rich guy. The B plot, I guess, the Beatrice and Norman. I thought that was a lot more interesting,
Yeah.
principally because of that. They weren't. It wasn't enormously explicit, but they did. I think it was very much alluded to that she had had sex before she married him, and that he still married her, but that obviously that was causing some uncertainties or insecurities for him, and all of that. I was really surprised that that kind of thing was being seen, but until I remembered that actually the whole there was this period before the code was came in Hollywood with all the the separate beds and all of the stuff we sort of think of or I think of as early Hollywood. This is before that. And actually, maybe this is a good moment to mention that while we were, in run up to watching this, I also watched Babylon, the movie with Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt that came out 2 or 3 years ago, which is on Netflix at the moment and is set like, totally in this time frame. It was a reminder that there was this kind of, I guess, like, Wild West period before all those rules had come in, and there was, even in the movies that the fictional movies within the movie and that, there was much more kind of, women drinking alcohol, for example, and, being quite scantily clad and close-ups of them taking off stockings and things like that was, like, quite risque. So, yeah, that B plot, that kind of extramarital sex thing, which is also nodded at with Anne, going to have her fling, all of these things, those sort of were a bit more interesting to me, but it's hard to disentangle how much of that my reaction to all of that is the fact that I'm watching it in 2025,
Yeah.
and there's been 100 years of movies and, endless rom-coms and Boy Meets Girl and all of that, so yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I would have loved to have been able to get a, exit poll, if you will, of people walking out of the theater and getting initial reactions, at the
No, it
time.
wasn't great. I'm trying to think where it was. There was a great, like a poll that it was a poll of teenagers that I think was taken in, like, 1933 or something like that, of, like, which movies basically, it was the movie that was most cited, that kinda young people. Oh, here we go. In surveys taken by the Payne Fund from 1919 to 1933 to gauge the influence of films on teenagers, this film was the one most often cited by teens.
Huh.
Which makes sense. It made me think
Yeah.
in a way of, this is quite a kind of random comparison, but I was in my early 20s, when Sex and the City was getting going. And so to me, those women were just like a little bit older, I mean, also they were in Manhattan,
Yeah.
but I could imagine in the same way these women, I guess they're supposed to be in their early 20s. But if you were kind of 14, 15, I don't know what age, teenagers were going to the movies in this period, but, there's something about when you're young, people who are they're still young, but they're just a little bit older than you are. They're a little
Right.
further down the road of life. I could completely see how if you were just a little bit younger than these women, it would seem, incredibly exciting and glamorous, the life that they were living. So
Yeah, definitely is something aspirational for late teens women of the day.
definitely.
And men, obviously, the men wanna be the rich guys, so it's something there for them to aspire to, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's the whole kind of society, really. I mean, it's young
Yeah.
people having fun, isn't it? The most of it. I mean, if you strip out the relatively insubstantial kind of romance plot, it's mostly just scenes of young people having a fantastic time. They're dancing, they're out in the countryside, they're at the beach, they're at the yacht club, they're having a wonderful time.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously we've mentioned Miss Crawford quite a bit, and we'll come back to her a couple times throughout the series of Oscar years because she does eventually win an Oscar for her 1945 role in Mildred Pierce. I guess she had a little bit of an up and down career from what I read, becoming very popular here in the late 20s with her whole flapper image, and then kind of coming on some hard times a little bit later in the 30s before kind of rising again in the 40s and even continuing on into the 50s.
Well, yeah, I think the only thing that I had seen her in before was Whatever Happened to Baby Jane,
Yeah.
which is much, much older. And even though, she's one of those names, isn't she, from the golden age of Hollywood, you Rita Hayworth, Betty Davis, Greta Garbo, all these kind of names to
Yeah.
conjure with. But I realized I hadn't actually seen her in anything, I think, other than Baby Jane when she's playing a kind of, well, I think she was, what would she have been? When is that, early 60s? So she's probably in her like 50s or 60s at that stage. But in my recollection, she seemed like they both her and Betty Davis in that film are like old ladies. They probably weren't
Mhm.
actually that old, but I suppose 60
Yeah.
was pretty old, 50 years ago maybe. Older than we feel it to be now. But she's one of those legendary names, but I'd not actually really seen her in any of I guess, the films from which the legend was born. And watching her in this, you just could completely see why, she became a huge star. Yeah, she's not like a classic beauty, but she's just kind of really delightful and charming in this movie. She's kind of, yeah, she's got those eyes, but also just kind of like a really bubbly, winning personality, and obviously the dancing and
Yeah, you mentioned that the camera loves her. There's one shot towards the middle, I think it's when they're, in the party, kinda at that lodge, the yacht club, whatever it is. It's a opening shot in the scene where there's a bunch of people dancing, and the camera zooms in through the dancers, and they kind of separate, and she's sitting at a table behind that, and it kinda zooms right up in on her face, and it was one of my favorite shots of the entire film there, and again, going back to the Best Cinematography nomination, I think a lot of things like that. I also noticed there was a lot of mirrors in various scenes, especially when they're getting dressed and they're getting ready before they go out to these parties. I can't imagine how difficult it had to have been shooting around mirrors in a time when there's no CGI. You can't go in and clean it up in
yeah.
post production. You got to make sure everything's out of the shot before you set it up.
Also, I mean, I wasn't completely sure whether some of this was just that, I wasn't watching the most crisp cut of it on YouTube, but it seemed like there was quite often that it was quite shallow depth of focus. The faces were really sharp, but then there's quite soft, soft focus background from that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess we'll touch briefly on some of the other actors. Let's see, John Mac Brown, who plays Ben. The interesting fact I found about him was he went to the University of Alabama for college and actually played halfback. And there's one when he's first introduced, they introduce him as the best halfback from Alabama, and I was like, they're actually talking about him. They didn't. I thought it was just the character trait in the movie, but they were actually talking about the actor in there. So that kind of surprised me a little bit. And he's going to show up in a couple of the other films that we're covering this season on the podcast. Niels Astor, who plays Norman, was from Denmark originally and came to Hollywood in around this time in the late 20s. And actually saw that he was, I don't know if he was really closeted, but he was a gay man at a time when that obviously was not something that was widely accepted, although more accepted in Hollywood than in other places.
Yeah.
And he did marry a woman by the name of Vivian Duncan, kind of tried to mask that side of him, but that did not last, and they divorced not long afterward. Dorothy Sebastian, who plays Beatrice, she also went to the University of Alabama around the same time as John Mac Brown, and she was briefly married to William Boyd, who we've talked about several times on the podcast already. And it struck me it was a Hollywood romance. They appeared in a movie together, and they got married about a year later. So, I think of like the Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner, or the Brad
Angelina.
Pitt and Angelina
Yeah.
Jolie. It was happened 100 years ago, and it's still going on today. And then obviously kind of the last one, Anita Page, you already talked about her a little bit. She's also going to show up again in the Broadway Melody, same director. And I saw a note that she was referred to as a blonde, blue-eyed Latin and the girl with the most beautiful face in Hollywood in the 20s.
Oh, wow. And she was pretty young, right? I read that she was 18
Yeah.
when they shot this film.
Yep, she's born in 1910, so she was the youngest of this group in terms of the actors, that were on screen, and I also read that she apparently was so beautiful, she received, marriage proposals from none other than Mussolini.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't obviously, that never amounted to anything, but, if you're catching the attention of guys like that, you're obviously I'm not sure if that means you're doing something right, but there's something there, I suppose.
Wow, that's really interesting. Did you find out any more about why she kind of faded away?
I didn't see too much. There's it was oh, no, it wasn't her. They did see that Dorothea Sebastian, who played Beatrice, she was arrested and had some legal issues, but I didn't see anything else too much
I think
about
what I
Anita
read, it was just
Page.
quite vague. It kind of said, to do Hollywood politics or something meant that
Yeah.
she never really she kind of fell out of favor.
Yeah, and the last little bit of info I had about her was that before she passed away in 2008, she was the last living person who had attended the first Academy Awards. So circling back to our previous season.
2008.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep. So she lived to a ripe old age, almost 100 years
Yeah,
old,
wow.
and she was the last attendee living from there.
Just going back to John McBrown, I think I've just recalled. I think another thing I read about him was because this is right on that transitional period, isn't it? When the talkies are, we're kind of already here. The jazz thing has already come out, but that he was one of those actors that kind of didn't really thrive because of his accent. He had that quite strong Southern accent. I'm fascinated by that transition. I guess that's going to be coming, isn't it, in the next kind of seasons of this podcast? But
Yeah, I think both John McBrown and Niels Astor struggle with that. Obviously, one being from the South, one being foreign born. So, and we saw that with I'm drawing a blank on his name from The Last Command when we spoke
well,
before.
yeah, the Austrian.
So we obviously see a lot of people struggle with that as time goes on. And it would be a little bit remiss if we didn't mention George Barnes, the cinematographer, obviously nominated for the cinematography here. I was surprised he had actually shot five of the films that were nominated for Oscars between both the first and second Academy Awards. He had three at the first one and two at the second Academy Awards. Only nominated for cinematography for this one, I think, but he would end up going on to be nominated 8 times and would win an Oscar, in 1940 for shooting Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca,
Yeah.
which is a beautiful film, so can't wait to get to that one a little ways down the road.
Yeah, hugely prolific. You look at the list
Yeah.
of, I mean, I suppose that it's the height of the studio system, isn't it? I guess these guys are employed by MGM or whoever, but they're just out there turning these things out.
They're cranking them out at that
Yeah,
point.
yeah. But it did I mean, it looked fantastic. We talked about the sets already,
Yeah.
but the outside, the exterior, those shots at the beach, but also, Bea and Norman's house. There's that lovely scene of Diana and Bea walking back to that house, and it's raining, and it just a lot of this movie felt sort of surprisingly really modern to me in its look.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely of the time, but also, very it almost thinking about the stylistic, sets and all of that thing, the production design and all of that, I was almost a little bit reminded of The Brutalist,
Yeah.
how very distinctive a lot of those scenes are, a lot of the locations, the library that is fairly famous from that movie. Obviously, I don't think there's really not as anything as iconic as that, but, just in general, some of the sets and the design of this film are really beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good looking movie.
Well, I want to get on to our final thoughts here. I think we've covered, the length and breadth of this pretty well. Any final thoughts before we give some ratings?
Well, the one other thing that, I came across was just that it was a sort of intriguing, and I don't know if I will get around to doing this, but there were a couple of other they're not sequels, but they're kind of follow-up movies with the same 3 same women. Our Modern Maidens and Our Blushing Brides, I think they're called. So kind of if this is Our Dancing Daughters, but it's from those titles alone, I'm guessing that it's these or whether it's not I don't think it is the same characters, but, similar archetypes of characters getting just, like, a little bit older. And I don't know, I think the last of those is a talkie, so that's intriguing. They had a formula, it was really popular, and they went back and did kind of did some more with the same people. It would be interesting potentially to watch those, I think, having seen this one.
Yeah, I think, I like you said, I don't think it is the same characters, but a lot of the same actors. So definitely interesting to see how that progresses. And actually, I just looked up Our Modern Maidens. So Joan Crawford is obviously the star in that one, starring opposite Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who, as we'll hear, I think next week on the podcast, she is about to be engaged to when this film comes out. So again, going back to that whole you star in a film with somebody, you end
Yeah.
up getting married to them, like we see today.
Starting to get the era of the Hollywood gossip, all the marriages and the relationships and the whisperings and as you were saying with Neil Astor, the closeted sort of stories and yeah, there's a lot going on in that era.
Yeah, and people love that gossip as much today as they did then, and obviously you had to get it either going to the movies and watching it or getting it in the newspaper back then.
Yeah.
But the medium has changed in today's world, but the actual content really hasn't changed much.
Yeah.
Well, let's give some ratings here. I will go first, and I will say I gave this a 7 out of 10. I, was, as we've talked about, pretty down on the story overall, but in terms of some of the things we've talked about stylistically, cinematography, costumes, all of that, I was very high on those aspects of the film. So it kind of balanced things out for a 7 out of 10 from me.
Yeah, I was teetering between a 6 and a 7. I mean, in a way, like, now now it's receding into I feel very fondly, like, I feel really happy to have seen it. It was a really fun time. I mean, I think the story was kind of a bit lame, but I'm also conscious that that might just be that may be slightly unfair on the movie. Like, I can't help but be bringing my own, modern sensibilities to it. But yeah, the cinematography, Joan Crawford was delightful, as were the other actresses and the guys, albeit I found them slightly, they were slightly indistinguishable, but they were all charming. The mothers as well. It was nice to see some older women on the screen. Great music. It's just a fun thing to watch. Very different from the as you mentioned, the Last Command that you and I previously talked about. Which is
Yes.
very serious,
Yep.
very melodramatic, tragedy. This was just frothy, great fun.
People having a good time.
Slightly spoiled by a ridiculous, falling down the stairs at the end, but I can forgive that really. So yeah, I was do you know what? I will give it a 7. I've talked myself into it.
Wonderful. I was probably more on the 6 side as well when I watched it the first time, and then when I went back and kind of revisited it a little bit, I got some more appreciation for some of those technical aspects, so I was able to bump it up a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Well, I will be sure to include a list of resources and links to any of the articles and reviews that we mentioned throughout the episode, as well as where you can see it online. And Vicky, thanks once again for coming back on the show to talk about Our Dancing Daughters. Where can people find you one more time online?
So I'm on Substack, vickileslie.substack.com, currently under the title of Meandering Over the Pebbles. May have changed by the time this airs. I should plug my movie as well, The Atom, A Love Affair, which is a history of the nuclear industry through the prism of a kind of stormy love affair, appropriately enough, given what we've just been talking about. And you can find that at theatomfilm.com.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast, where I will be discussing the film White Shadows in the South Seas. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.